Mountains by Julie Ko. Mr. Riverfield was an unusually tall man. He was so tall that during conversations in the streets of Tsuyazaki, his neighbors would take 5 steps back from him to avoid straining their necks. Although Mr. Riverfield was unfailingly kind to his shorter neighbors, his heart really had an affinity for taller things. Trees, for instance. Mountains, too. In fact, his childhood dream had been to conquer the highest mountains in the world. Unfortunately, he hadn't yet conquered the highest mountains because his job at the local post office dominated his life. He had initially tried to keep the dream alive by writing secret letters to his favorite peaks, expressing regret that he had not yet visited them. He would seal the letters in yellow envelopes and hide them in a drawer at home, keeping them under his Yamakasa uniform. But as he grew older, his dream felt increasingly out of reach, and he finally resolved to set his sights on something smaller. The wooden house where Mr. Riverfield happened to live was typical of the houses in Tsuyazaki. In particular, it had low ceilings that forced him to walk around hunched over. One morning, after hitting his head on the kitchen doorframe for the umpteenth time, Mr. Riverfield decided that his new aspiration would be to build a house with impossibly high ceilings. His neighbors soon discovered that he had curious ideas about house construction. At first, nothing about his building method seemed peculiar, except that the man was adamant about working entirely on his own. He commenced by taking a shovel and digging a hole on a bare plot of land, which was a few streets away from his existing home. Oh, the villagers thought, he's preparing the foundations. But as the weeks passed, the hole became deeper and deeper, as if Mr. Riverfield was trying to tunnel right into the center of the earth. His neighbors watched as he spent his days off work, climbing into the hole with bundles of timber strapped to his back. No one could get a good view of what he was doing in there, but everyone knew it was extremely odd. Mr. Riverfield's activities took a visible toll on his body, but he persevered until his entire supply of timber had disappeared down the hole. Then he engaged in an even stranger process, which involved carrying assorted furnishings into the hole. Tatami mats, a shoji door, a cupboard, a round table, a lantern, silk zabuton cushions, a clay teapot set, and so on. Eventually, Mr. Riverfield dusted off his hands, grabbed his shovel, and began to fill the hole with dirt. The villagers watched as he covered the hole completely, and then turned his attention to watering the ground, as if he had just planted a tree. By this point, they had grown very concerned about Mr. Riverfield's state of mind. Shouldn't he have some idea of how houses are built? They muttered to each other. Nevertheless, they kept bringing him buckets of water to help him soak the soil. Mr. Riverfield noticed the worried looks on their faces, but all he said to them was, "I suppose you need depth to achieve height." He sat on a stool day after day, keeping vigil over his patch of land. Once a week, he would rise, stretch, and tend to the watering in silence. Passing by, his neighbors wondered if he'd forgotten about his job at the post office, and couldn't help but think about the prospect of so much expensive wood rotting in the ground. Now and then they brought meals to Mr. Riverfield, but otherwise left him to his own devices. One afternoon, as rain poured down, Mr. Riverfield slumped forward and fell off his stool. he had become gravely ill and was confined to bed. People assumed that his illness stemmed not just from exhaustion, but also from the distress of pouring everything he had into a home that would never be realized. The next week, Mr. Riverfield summoned his neighbors to his bedside. They were alarmed to see how frail he had become and feared that his final hours had arrived. In a near whisper, he began to sing a song about celebration and joy, branches flourishing and leaves growing thick. The villagers knew the song and joined in, even though it was an odd time to sing it. As their voices swelled, the building started to shudder. The ground beneath them shook, and an ominous rumbling filled the air. Mr. Riverfield's neighbors crouched with their hands covering their heads or held onto the nearest beams. When the shaking stopped, they left Mr. Riverfield's bedside and wandered the streets to inspect the damage. Miraculously, everything seemed to have been left untouched. On their way towards Mr. Riverfield's plot of land, they saw that a towering wooden house had suddenly appeared on it, covered in leaves. There was a stone path out the front and a straw amulet on the door. Inside, the house was tastefully furnished, with steaming cups of tea and zabuton cushions waiting for them at a round table. The house boasted the highest ceilings ever seen in Tsuyazaki. One of Mr. Riverfield's neighbors found a yellow envelope next to a clock at the entrance. It seemed to have materialized with the house. The letter inside contained a single sentence. Mr. Riverfield regrets to inform you that he has gone to conquer another mountain.